Hi guys, and welcome to the first of a few videos to do with the January 2022 exam. In this video we're going to be looking at tasks 1 and 2. First of all, we need to make sure that we understand that there is a key piece of information given to us in our exam when we first open the paper. There's an information to students page that you should look at. This provides us with opportunities to see some information that could be useful for us later on in the exam paper. So please make sure you read this first. So let's move on to the first of the questions that we need to look at, question 1. We can see here that we are required to create some form of relational database and show a screen print of this relationship. We need to make sure that we minimize the opportunities for data duplication, make sure that it accepts the data provided, it uses recognized naming conventions, and ensures that data integrity is kept. So at this point, I want to make sure that you're all aware of the naming conventions that we should be using inside of our Access database. The examiners are going to be looking to make sure that we use a certain prefix for tables, forms, queries, and reports. Normally, the naming convention would require us to use the first 3 letters, for example, TBL to represent table, then maybe an underscore, and then the name of the table. But let's move on to the relationships itself. Here's our data set. What I would suggest we do in this instance is look for key information that's obvious to us. So the first thing we can see is that we have a student and student ID. Then I would move through the table and look at any other fields that would have other student information. So as you can see here, we've highlighted student first name, student surname, and student email. Then we're going to move on to the next table. We can see here we've got subject, so let's move subject ID, the subject title, and the subject level. That's clearly another table. Then we move on to the class, and we can see that we have class ID and the class start date. We've now taken our 9 fields out of our flat file database and normalized them into individual tables. We can see we have a table for student, subject, and class. However, we need to make a link between these tables, so I need to move to the next step of normalization, where we're going to associate primary keys as foreign keys to create the links between the tables. The first table that we need to do this to will be moving the subject ID into the classes table along with the class ID. This will allow us to have multiple classes that have the same subject being taught. A clear example of this in our dataset is where we can see that class ID number 6 has subject maths, which is being taught. And then if we look at class ID 1, we can see that the same subject is being taught in that class. Now our next challenge is to link the table for class with a student. This doesn't naturally link, so we're going to need to create a joining table. This joining table will contain the class ID and the student ID. So the reason for creating the joining table is because of the problem we have where one student can attend many classes, and many classes can have many students. It's not a good idea to have a many-to-many relationship inside of an Access database. So that's why we create what's known as a joining table, so that we can have one-to-many relationships. So as you can see from the diagram here, we have one student can appear in many enrollments, and many enrollments can appear in one class, and many classes can have one subject. We're now going to move on to task 2, where we're going to create our tables and our structure. When we create our tables and structures, we need to make sure that we've read Activity 2 properly. We have a number of required elements inside of this that must appear and be inside of our database structures. So as you go through the creation of your database, ensure that you have this document open so that you can remind yourself of the required elements inside your tables. So let's get started with creating our database. First of all, we need to create a blank database. You'll be prompted to make sure that you save your database with an appropriate name and to an appropriate location. Make sure you give your database a name that you can use and remember and refer to inside of your work. As you can see here, I've given it Part A database, and then I'm going to hit the Create button, and it should take us straight into a design window for a table. We obviously want to format this first table to have the fields that we need for our database. So click on the Design key, and it will automatically prompt us to save this table. As I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure we're using the correct prefix, so TBL, and then an underscore and student. This takes us straight into the design view where we can start to put in the field names as is outlined in our dataset. So the first ID or first field name that we need to put in is student underscore ID. Notice our data type has already been defined for us as an auto number. In this instance, and for this database exam, auto number is okay. In some of the other database series, you may find that the number starts on a higher number, something like 1000. So you may need to choose a number as a format here. Then we move on to student underscore first name. In here, we're going to choose short text, and please make sure that you change the field size of your database field from the default to something more suitable. Then we're going to move to the next field inside of our student table, which is going to be student surname. As with the first name, we're going to choose the data type to be short text, and we're going to change the field size again to move it from the default value. Now we're going to move on to the last of our fields, which is the student email. Earlier on in the video and early on in the exam paper, we have seen some information relating to how the student email should be laid out. This is going to be important to us to make sure that we get marks inside of this part of our paper. What we need to do is choose the correct data type for this field, which will be short text. So what we need to do is go down to our properties panel, and we're going to change the field size from 255, the default as we mentioned earlier on. We're going to change this to 19. This will allow us to ensure that all of the information that's input into this text box area is consistent with the requirements as laid out inside of the first part of our exam paper. We're then going to change our format to be the @ sign. And then we're going to move on to our input mask. On the screen at the moment you can see the requirements of our input mask and how our characters should be displayed. So in order to achieve the capitalization of the first letter, we're going to use the greater than symbol. Then we're going to put the letter L as our placeholder. This allows us to enter a letter, and the greater than symbol will make sure that that letter is first capitalized. Then we're going to use the less than symbol, which makes sure that the letters after that will be in a lowercase, and we get to our first speech mark. That first speech mark allows us to put the underscore in, and we're going to close that speech mark, and then we're going to put the greater than symbol again so we can capitalize the first letter, and then we're going to do the less than symbol again to make sure the next letter is lowercase, and then we come to our final speech mark where we're going to put the @washer.ac.uk and close the speech mark. We're going to add a little description inside of our table just to make sure that it's clear that we're using an input mask and that it's going to capitalize the first few letters of the first and last name inside of the prefix. And then we're going to go save. Just before we go on to save, we're just going to jump straight into the student first name, and we're going to put a validation rule in here so that we can force the user to make sure that they put a first name value in. And in order for us to do that, we're going to create a validation rule where it says that it is not null, so we cannot allow null values to be entered. And we're going to provide the user a nice little message to remind them to please enter in the student first name. Just before we click off, we're just going to make sure that the primary key is attached to the student ID, and then we're going to click close, and we're going to choose yes to save the table. Now we're going to move on to the creation of our next table in this exercise. So we're going to click on the ribbon, go to create, go to table design, and in here we're going to get our first field name that we want to put in. As we had in our layout on our normalisation, we're going to be looking at the next area of subject. So our first field name is going to be subject ID, and we're going to choose the data type of this to be auto number. This will allow us to count our numbers up sequentially and allow the database to do the numbering for us. Then we move on to the subject title, and we're going to choose data type of short text. We're going to set the value to be around about 50, which should be appropriate for the data set that we're going to be placing in this field. We're then going to move on to the subject level. And in this instance, we're going to choose the data type to be number. We know from our data set that our numbers for our subject level range from 1 to 3. This was also provided as information to us in the information to the students area. In order for us to do this, we're going to create some form of combo box. So what we need to do is click on the Lookup tab, select the display control to be combo box, and we're going to choose the row source type to be of a value list. The row source is where we enter in the values that we want to appear in that list. We're going to enter the values of 1, 2 and 3 with a semicolon to separate the values. This is not the only way that you can achieve this outcome. You can do it in a number of different ways. The alternative way for us to do the subject level is to use what's known as the Lookup Wizard. The Lookup Wizard will provide us with a wizard walkthrough of how and where we can put the information. So as we can see from the example, we follow the steps and we can enter in the values of 1, 2 and 3, and we're going to give the label of subject level and click finish. Notice the outcome from using the wizard is exactly the same as that which we used earlier on in using a combo box value list and the value row source to be 1, 2 and 3. We're going to click back on general. We're going to make sure that there's a validation rule, and the validation rule is going to make sure that we can only have values between 1 and 3. So in order for us to do this, we simply enter between 1 and 3 in our validation rule, and then we're going to provide some text to the user to allow them to know what they need to do. So please enter a value between 1 and 3. We need to make sure that we've created a subject ID as a primary key. Then we go and save the table. We're going to give the table the prefix of TBL underscore subject and select OK. We're then going to move on to the third of our tables. We need to click on Create Table, and we're going to go into the first area of the field name. Our field name in this instance is going to deal with the class, and we're going to give it class ID. As with our previous examples, we're going to choose the data type to be auto number, and we're going to put in some information around the class date. So in here we're going to choose the data type to be time date, and if we look at our data set, we can see that our time date is identified as being day day, month month, year year, year year. So in order for us to choose that, we're going to click on the format, and we're going to choose the short date option, which should allow us to enter in the information as is laid out in our data set. And then finally we're going to create the third and final field name, which will be our foreign key, and that's going to be our subject ID. And as it's a foreign key, we need to make sure that it's going to be of a number data type so that we can create an effective relationship. We're going to click on our class ID, make sure that that's associated as a primary key. We're going to click on close, choose yes, and then give it an appropriate table name. So in this instance, we're going to use TBL underscore class. Click OK and save. Now we're going to move on to our fourth and final table, which is our joining table. Again, as we did before, we're going to click on Create Table and then go into the field name. And this is where we're going to be creating the first of our two composite primary keys. We're going to be using the class ID, and we need to make sure that this is number. This is our foreign key from the class table. And then we're going to put our second foreign key, which will be student ID. We need to make sure again that this is a data type of number. And then if we don't declare any primary key and click and close this table, making it have an appropriate name, saving it, and we call it TBL underscore enrollments, you'll get displayed a message once you click OK. it notifies you that there's no primary key identified in this table. You can choose to allow access to put one in for you. In this instance, I don't want access to put one in, so I'm just going to click no. If this happens to you, it is not a problem. We can go back into the design view, as we do with any table, and we can go back in and we can make sure that we associate these two keys as our composite primary key. So if we open up the table, go back into the design view, in order for us to select both the keys, simply select and drag down and then press primary key. Notice that both field names have a primary key attached to them. This creates our composite primary key. A composite primary key is essentially two values put together that will create a unique identifier. We're now going to move on to the relationships within inside of our database. This is going to be how we link the tables together. If you don't have the Add Table section on the right hand side, you can simply click on the Add Tables button and that will allow you to see the tables in the view. Double click on them to add them. Now what we want to do here is we want to drag our primary keys into the foreign key areas to establish the links and the relationships. So what I'm doing here is I'm laying out the table design similar to what we saw earlier on in our normalization process. I'm dragging the subject ID down here from the subject key area to the class to make the relationship, and you'll notice that there is a one-to-many relationship established. Now we want to create a link between the class and the enrollment. We select the primary key, drag it into the foreign key area of the enrollment, and notice we have our one-to-many. And then finally we're going to make the link between the enrollment and the student table by dragging the student ID into the enrollments table. And here we can see we've created a required relationship. Make sure you enforce the update and delete cascade options in all of your relationships as you create them. We're going to select the close option, click on yes to save, and now you have established your relationships within your tables, within your Access database, adhering to all of the required elements as outlined in task 2. In this section of the video, we're going to go through the entry of the data into our database, now that we've created our tables. First of all, we're going to start off with the subject table. In here, we're going to enter in all of the subjects that we have available. So as we can see from our dataset, we've got a number of different subjects such as GCSE Maths, AS Level Computing, A Level Computing, and these are ranging from levels 2 to 3. This is a good opportunity for us to check that our subject level options are working correctly and allow us to enter in either 1, 2 or 3 and only those values within. If you find that you've got a problem, this is an opportunity for you to go inside the table design and change it to make sure that it works as we did in the video. Now we're moving on to the student information. As you can see here, we're entering in the student information, and when we enter inside the student email, you'll notice that the input mask displays when we start typing inside the cell, but when we come outside the cell, the value is just the information that we inputted into the actual database. This is due to how we formatted our table inside of the design view earlier on. As you can see from the screen here, we entered the format to be an @ sign. The @ sign will allow us to remove the washers.ac.uk and the underscore from the email itself. This should save a little bit of space in terms of size of our database. If we were to remove the @ sign, what that will do is it will output the whole text input that we do, including the @washers and the underscore between the name. We're now going to move on to the class table. In here we're going to put the information relating to each of the classes that we have available to us. As you can see here, we have the option to use either the calendar that's built into the system, or we can input the date value in as we want to, and as is displayed in the data set that we've been given by the exam board. Notice the plus signs on the side of the screen here. This shows that there is some relationship between this table and another, and it will be the subject ID that links the table and the class table together. We then move on to the enrolments table. Here we're going to create the establishment between the student, the class, and the enrolment of a class. Notice here we're just putting the numerical values that are displayed inside of the actual database itself. And at this point, it's a good opportunity for us to test that our composite primary key works by entering a value that's duplicated. Here I'm just expanding all of the tables that are inside of our database just to make sure that the links are established. And it's also a good opportunity for us to check that the data that we have inside of our database is correct. So we can see in some instances that one student might attend 2 classes, whereas another student might only attend 1. Thanks for watching the videos, guys. Don't forget to click the subscribe button for more content to come. Hopefully this has been useful for you in your exam revision.